Our new Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, has just announced her new plans to deal with Britain's illegal immigration. People are absolutely furious with her proposal.
Many of these individuals are actually already coming knowing that they have something lined up for them. Deliveroo, car washes and nail bars. These gangs obviously have those sort of off-the-grid businesses. This is becoming a recognised route for individuals to put in an application for asylum.
She has talked about creating more, quote-unquote, new safe and legal routes. I think Zia Youssef called it a Trojan horse.
We've already spent about 16 billion in the asylum system since 2019, a lot of it on hotels. I think that money would have been much better invested in constructing detention facilities where those individuals that have come across on small boats could be housed.
Maybe you have examples of how Article 8 has been gamed.
Well, it's the chicken nugget example. The individual that couldn't be returned to Albania because his nephew was only really a fan of British chicken nuggets. The welfare support that these individuals get, the 24/7 around the clock. You don't like the food you've got, you can call a helpline. In the last 10 years, the British public have paid far more than they should have been expected to an asylum system. Almost 2/3 of individuals now want all illegal migrants deported from the country.
Your opinion, is it enough to work around as Mahmood is doing, or do you think we need to leave the ECHR? Before we get into this interview, I just wanted to say that we have noticed that more than half of our regular viewers are not subscribed. If you want to support the Winston Marshall Show, all you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, we can have more phenomenal guests exploring the issues you want to hear about that the mainstream media won't touch. But without further ado, on with the interview. Our new Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, has just announced her new plans to deal with Britain's asylum situation and illegal immigration. Britain has millions of illegal immigrants here. We have a crisis, I believe, when it comes to all sorts of immigration, both legal and illegal. And people are absolutely furious with her proposals, or I should say, the left of the Labour Party and those outside the Labour Party on the left are furious. Jeremy Corbyn called part of it disgusting. Owen Jones is furious that Tommy Robinson is claimed to be quite happy that the Overton window has moved to the right on the issue of immigration. And there's signs that there might be sort of a revolt and that perhaps it won't pass through Parliament if it's put to a vote. And meanwhile, Reform and the likes of Nigel Farage and Richard Tice are saying she maybe wants to think about joining Reform, kind of joking about it, but they also said it doesn't go far enough, particularly when it comes to leaving the ECHR. I say all of this to frame my conversation with you, Rob Bates, founder of the think tank Centre for Migration Control, and you've been writing reports about migration and immigration, Britain's various problems now for some time, and I'm keen to appraise Mahmood's proposals with you. Before we get into that, I wouldn't mind just understanding what the Centre for Migration Control is. On the one hand, you're cited quite regularly by Reform UK, and Nigel Farage cited you in the summer when he was doing Britain is Lawless campaign. But also, I watched an interview of Fraser Nelson last week, and he called you a bloke masquerading as a think tanker. So I'm not exactly sure what to make of it, but let's hear it in your own words.
Well, we are a think tank, and despite what Fraser might suggest, there is more than just me. I don't think I'd be able to carry on the operations of what we do just on my own shoulders. So there's a team of about 3 of us. One of us is part-time, but a team of 3 of us that basically look into the data that many journalists overlook, submit freedom of information requests on areas that we think actually the government isn't providing adequate data on. And our overriding objective really is to provide a sort of counter-narrative to what we've been fed, I'd say really since the 1990s, this idea that immigration is a universal good for the economy, for our culture, for society as a whole. And I think actually some of the stuff that we are producing, some of the stuff we are finding via freedom of information requests, whether it's on crime, whether it's on benefit claims, is really showing that actually what we have been told has been in large part a lie. And actually, really, there now needs to be a really frank conversation about how we begin to rectify the decisions that have been taken and ensure that we aren't further compounding the problems by taking more poor decisions. So really what we're doing is working with media outlets to make sure that actually the public have a rounded picture.
Okay. So again, before we go to Mahmood's proposals, I just wanted to pick up some of, or go into contentions. I'm not sure if it's quite a beef, but it seems to be some sort of public argument you had with Sky.
Yes.
And it's just worth getting to the root of this, because I'd still like to sort of understand where you stand and where the group stands in sort of how you assess and how you're doing your work here. So journalist Daniel Dunford wrote, this is because famously Farage used your data to say that Afghan males were 22 times more likely of being convicted of rape than somebody born in this country. Now, I'm keen to go into sort of crime data with you later in this conversation, but they then review your data and say it's actually the Afghans are 3 times more likely, not 22 times more likely. Now, it seems to me that if they're 3 times more likely, that's enough of a reason not to let Afghan males into the country. But that's obviously a drastic difference. And there seems to be 2 differences, right? Which is one, that your data doesn't do age adjustment correctly. And the other is this dispute between what is foreign-born and foreign national. Now, before we just go into that detail, what can you tell me about this data that the Afghans are 22 times more likely? Is it wrong that they're only 3 times? Do you stand by the point that they're 22 times more likely to commit crime? Sick of the lies and deception from the mainstream media? Regain control of your news with Ground News. Let's take a quick look at how the media is reporting on Trump's order to resume nuclear weapons testing. Left-leaning, Democracy Now! Around the headline, extraordinarily destabilizing decision. Trump denounced over call to immediately resume nuclear tests, while right-leaning Press TV led with, I had no choice. Trump orders U.S. War Department to immediately resume nuclear weapons testing. 2 very different narratives on the same story. We specifically partnered with Ground News because their app and website helped me and my team cut through media bias and see the full picture. There are over 645 articles published on Trump's decision, and we can access every single one through Ground News, complete with source context, lean ratings, and key breakdowns. Seeing all sides, regardless of political lean, is essential to cutting through bias and actually being informed. That's why Ground News' blind spot feed, which highlights stories underreported by either side, is such a powerful tool. I genuinely believe in what Ground News is doing, and I encourage you to check it out by scanning the QR code or visiting ground.news/Winston. If you subscribe through my link, you'll get 40% off unlimited access. Ground News is subscriber funded, and by supporting my sponsors, you are also supporting this show.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or convicted of rape.
Absolutely. Well, it was rape, sexual assault, general sexual offences was the data that we got provided by the Ministry of Justice. I'm actually surprised that Sky News still have this article on their website, because if you go to the bottom, you can see that there's sort of been a hurried few remedies and corrections issued on the record. And this was quite a sort of a saga, really, because this journalist had clearly approached the issue wanting to try and discredit these figures, and he'd deliberately chosen a denominator that wasn't befitting the numerator. So he'd deliberately chosen country of birth, population sizes, when the data we had was nationality convictions by nationality. It was that he'd actually, interestingly, in a version of this article, misquoted a Oxford academic who had asked them to take their quote out because, as they told me, his approach was statistically illiterate.
Is this the Oxford University's migration observation?
It is, yes. So okay. He had misattributed to them a quote suggesting that the use of country of birth denominator was the appropriate way to go about it. They've subsequently sort of asked him to remove that from the article, and actually throughout this article there have been all kinds of little tweaks and amendments. And then we go to the Met Police, of course, who he relies on their statement that country of birth is the proper denominator to use, and that was the real basis on which he produced his calculations. Unfortunately, the Met had actually made a mistake, and as Guido Fawkes reported, it was a result of human error that they told this journalist to use country of birth denominator rather than nationality denominator, because they hadn't realised actually the information that they provided us when it came to sexual offences in London was based on nationality. And then, of course, there was the ONS again, who hadn't been asked at all about providing a comment for this analysis. The journalist had just gone to them and said, hey, I'm just looking to understand what the population size of certain migrant communities is in the UK. How can I best go about understanding that? And they said country of birth. This journalist then decided to use that quote as justification for using country of birth in the analysis and the attempted fact check that he conducted on Nigel Farage.
It seems to me that country of birth would be more useful, because if the general argument is that immigrants bring in their culture, that even if they become a British national, they still will have, at least in part, if not in whole, the culture of their origin. So if you're trying to make a case that those of Afghani culture have a propensity to rape higher, wouldn't you prefer to use country of birth rather than the nationality?
I would love to. I think you're absolutely right. I think the idea that an individual spends 25 years living in Afghanistan, comes to Britain, and then 6 years later gets a British passport, the idea that he simply eschews his socialisation processes of his youth is pie in the sky. But unfortunately, we simply do not have the data on country of birth convictions. We only have data on nationality, on those individuals who haven't actually naturalised and become British citizens. And therefore, we have to make do with population estimates on nationality rather than on country of birth. And I think it's a really important point to actually recognise that when we consider facts such as a quarter of sexual assaults last year were committed by foreign nationals, when we consider the fact that nearly a quarter of rapes last year were committed by foreign nationals, actually within the 3/4 of that figure, the British population convictions, are many individuals that are migrants and have come from overseas and have come from places such as Afghanistan and have subsequently obtained that British citizenship. That means when it comes to crime data, they would be classified as British. So there are lots of problems with the way actually we deal with data in this country when it comes to actually recognising that just because an individual holds a British passport doesn't suddenly mean that they are sort of enacting the norms, the culture and the sort of socialisation processes of this country. So there's a lot that could be done, and I would hope that a future government coming in would actually make proper data collection a real priority, because at the moment we are having to deal with shadows, as it were.
So, the way I understood it is that if you use British nationals, it actually brings the data down to imply that they're not committing as much crime as you might have imagined if you're using foreign-born, which goes against the argument for immigration. Are you simply saying that it's just the whole thing is cloudy and foggy?
No. So what I'm saying is the raw data we got given in terms of convictions was by nationality. So when you see figures for, let's say, Somalia or Kenya or Libya, the numbers we get provided there are by individuals who hold the passport of that country, not were born in that country. So therefore, when we're trying to work out a per capita rate per 10,000, we can't use country of birth, because many of those individuals are now naturalised British citizens, and therefore in the raw data would be appearing under the British figure. So you have to sort of use like with like, otherwise you are really comparing apples and pears, and it doesn't really actually make sense. So, and this is sadly what the journalist has ended up doing in his fact check. He's ended up using a numerator by nationality and dividing that by a denominator, a country of birth, and the result is a completely skewed mismatch of actually what the raw data we got provided by the Ministry of Justice was.
So you actually stand by the 22 times more
100%,
likely.
100%.
Yeah, and so if you think Farage was right, and actually Farage himself, it wasn't himself, sorry, it was a Reform spokesperson came out and said they stand by that data.
Yeah, I mean, it would be a lot better, and we wouldn't have quite the same contention if, government bodies were more willing to come forward with this stuff, because, obviously as a think tank concerned about immigration, you're always going to get sort of gremlins on TikTok or journalists with a political agenda looking to attack you. So I would be very, very keen. And part of the reason why we are trying to push this data out there is to kind of bounce the government into producing it themselves, because they clearly hold the information. It's just they are not willing to provide it to the British public. So instead, we're having to do this work for them.
Right, okay. So let's move on to Mahmood's reforms. Would you mind, having read...
Yes.
You've done I also read the 35 pages, but I have to admit I had to read it quickly.
Yes, before.
Because it's only come out a couple hours ago. Would you mind, let's go through together the major reforms that she's proposing.
Okay, so the first one, the big flagship that was being trailed over the weekend was, of course, that refugees would have to wait 20 years to get settlement. They'd have to wait a period that was 4 times longer than they currently do. This was, presented in the Times and Telegraph and such forth as being an incredibly harshening of the measures. I actually think, having read the document, what they've really done is posit that as a worst case scenario for an individual, they've created sort of off ramps for individuals to get out of that 20-year route if they're eligible to go into study routes, if they're eligible to go into work routes, and if they can find an appropriate sponsor to help them to get off that leeway. So
at the moment it's 10 years.
At the moment, it's 5 years actually from grant of refugee status to obtaining settled status. So it would take really, it's 5 years effectively.
Okay. So they're increasing it to 20.
Increasing it to 20.
But there are more off ramps.
There's more off-ramps, and a key point about this actually, and this really sets them apart from what the Tories were trying to do, is that individuals who arrive in the country illegally, i.e. via small boat predominantly, will still be able to go on this pathway. Now, the Tory plans were that individuals who have come into the country on a small boat would never be eligible for settled status, and therefore they would also be disbarred from citizenship, because citizenship is one step along from settled status. So actually what these plans have done in a way is kind of ordain and give a sort of hint of approval to that method, and saying it's still somehow a valid route to obtain that settled status in Britain, which really gives you sort of a lot of security. It allows your children to be British citizens by birth. It allows you, of course, to bring individuals over. But even in that 20-year period, they still hold that refugee status, which as soon as they get it, does give them a whole raft of benefits already. I think it gives them access to universal credit. They can start accessing social housing. They can start having a conversation about family reunions as well. There was an interesting study that came out actually today, which showed that 66% of people that hold refugee status right now are claiming universal credit, which I think gives you some semblance of the costs involved with this. Other studies have recently shown by the Home Office certain refugee routes, about 12% of individuals on those routes are in employment, and a lot of economic inactivity is taking place on these routes. So I think this idea of actually it being somehow a huge boon to the British taxpayer to prolong this process doesn't bear out by the fact that we know these individuals, as soon as they get their refugee status, already have a lot of rights in the UK anyway.
Yeah, but this is illegally, right? These are those who enter illegally that we're talking about, or is this?
Yes. So for 20 years, it's 20 years for those who've entered illegally. It'll be 10 years for those who are coming on sort of government-sponsored refugee routes, like more recognised, sort of as we saw with the Afghanistan,
so you said 10
Ukraine,
years,
and Hong Kong. Yeah, 10 years. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So it's worth thinking about this. So the majority of people who come illegally, is it via the Channel and small boats, or is it those who come here legally and then stay illegally?
So we don't actually have proper exit data. We haven't had it since about 2020 to know how many individuals coming on visas are overstaying. There were some suggestions that, certain nationalities have a high propensity, if they're on a tourist visa route or on a study visa route, just to simply disappear rather than returning at the end of their visa. But the fact is, and as you pointed out at the start of the show, we already have a huge legal migrant population. Most of that is driven by those who have overstayed visas. The small boats crisis, and it is still a crisis, is really actually quite small fry when you consider the sheer numbers of people that have been able to stay in the country for long periods of time because they haven't left at the end of the visa. The Pew Research estimates 700,000 to 900,000 illegal migrant population. That was in 2017. Total, but that was in 2017. And of course, since then, exit controls have really fallen by the wayside in terms of quality. We've handed out record numbers of visas, so more people are likely by default to have overstayed those visas as well. And then, of course, we have seen actually a compounding of individuals doing that irregular entry as well. And the irregular entry is really the sort of tip of the iceberg. It's the most visible type of illegal migration. It's, before the small boats, it was the lorries and it was individuals sneaking in via other covert means. But a large percentage of those that are staying illegally or in the country illegally have done so after getting actually the initial permission to come into the country.
When you say irregular, well, I thought that was a sort of woke term for saying illegal.
Yeah, I've been reading too many Home Office data sets, unfortunately. It is illegal. It's done without permission. It's done without the permission of the authority into the state to which you're entering. But it's at the same time, irregular does...
Is it different from illegal in any way?
No, they're synonymous.
Okay. So if they are coming illegally, and a lot of them, as you described, not all of them are coming from France, then isn't there an argument to say, well, they're coming from a safe country? Why should they ever be, if they break the law to come here in the first place, why should they ever be given refuge? I mean, there isn't a war, as far as I know, going on in France. Why should we have any incentive for them to come here?
And this is it. This is what the principle of that last Conservative government was when they were trying to grip the problem, the recognition that actually these are individuals who've come here with no sort of right. They haven't put in an application. They haven't been approved by the Home Office, the authorities. They're falling foul of actually some sections of immigration law, which I couldn't recite off the top of my head. But in reality, actually, what Mahmood's plans have done is really say that this is becoming a sort of quasi-recognised route for individuals to put in an application for asylum. And this was something that the Conservatives never went anywhere near. So, I don't want to use the term loosely, but I do consider this as sort of a preemptive amnesty for many individuals that might be looking to break into our country going forward. And again, if we're talking about reducing pull factors, if you're actually saying to an individual, you're coming over a small boat, we would still consider maybe actually, if you put in an asylum claim, allowing you to stay for 20 years as a refugee and then maybe give you settled status on top of that. It really doesn't work in terms of getting actually that deterrent in place.
Let's go for the most contentious piece, which is the so-called jewellery clause,
Yes.
which is that assets such as jewellery, cars and e-bikes will be required to contribute towards the taxpayer-funded bed, board and financial support for those asylum seekers. So this is what Corbyn called disgusting, and I think someone from Novara Media, the far-left media group, posted a photograph of all the shoes stacked up at Auschwitz as sort of an example of this. This actually has been trialled in Denmark. This is something the centre-left party over there, led by Mette Frederiksen, is one of their many reforms, and I'm of the understanding that Mahmood actually visited Denmark and a lot of their policies have been copied from this. So what can you tell me about this proposal?
Well, you've got those Labour MPs calling it all kinds of sort of undesirable terms. I think actually, really, this is a red herring. This is the Home Secretary has gone over with the team from the Home Office on a fact-finding mission to Denmark to look at their asylum system, and they've seen this sort of component nestled amongst a lot of other measures and thought, this feels like a bit of red meat that we can dangle in the media in the sort of build-up to our announcement. This seems tough. This seems like we're sort of not messing around, and actually we are going to fight for the British taxpayer to get a fair deal. But in reality, when you actually look at the sort of scale to which these measures have been used in Denmark, I think it's a couple of dozen times at best. And when you compare that with the sheer numbers that are coming across on the channel, you kind of recognise that actually this is little more than a kind of a gimmick, effectively. It's something to sound tough. It's something to say to the British public, we recognise your concerns about the fact that, the asylum system budget has ballooned. It's gone up from, I think, about 500 million in 2019 to, just short of 5 billion 2 years ago, a situation that is really out of control. And we're going to start making sure that actually you're not being left out of pocket because of this. It really won't amount to anything. It has been done to sort of grab a few headlines. And frankly, I actually think it's probably one of the most irrelevant parts, despite it being the most contentious, one of the most irrelevant parts of the proposal being put forward, because it won't really deter any individual because, as I said, a couple of dozen people losing a few gold rings or something like that, it doesn't strike me as a particularly all-encompassing measure.
It seems like it might deter those who, not the channel crossers maybe, but the ones who come here maybe with a bit more money and want to stay in the country because they've got a slightly better life and they might have built up a little bit of assets already. So it seems like that they're the ones who might be deterred by
perhaps
this.
We'll have to see. As I said, evidence suggests that perhaps it's pretty difficult to implement. It's probably not something that actually, if it does end up with sort of appeals and stuff like that, or even actually when it comes to human rights law, it will be very easy to implement. I think also, whether it actually comes to legislating for this or whatever measures they do come to, whether this is part of a package or whether you'll end up with rebellions from Labour MPs as a result of this as well. I can't see this becoming something that we're talking about in 3 months' time. I just think it will fall by the wayside.
And it doesn't sound like it's something that is stomachable by, if it does have, is this going to have to go through Parliament for a vote, this bill?
This will have to. They are, I mean, when they're talking about amending Article 8 and Article 3 of the ECHR and twisting the implementation of it, that will have implications for the Blairite Human Rights Act, and therefore that will require votes in Parliament. And this is probably what Mahmood is trying to avoid a massive rebellion on, with actually the way this bill has been, this plan has been cobbled together, because whilst the headlines seem very tough and the rhetoric has been very ferocious, the meat and substance of the plan is something that I could well see many many centrist Labour MPs getting on board with. And I can well imagine that in the last few days, they've all been having phone calls off Home Office ministers telling them, actually, just wait until you see the plan, look at the plan. The plan actually is something that is relatively comfortable. We've just got to dangle these few trinkets to make sure that, we can kind of seem like we're listening to the public's concerns, because the public are concerned about this. Polling shows consistently, almost 2/3 of individuals now want all illegal migrants deported from the country. This is a situation that after 7 years of small boats, people are really, really sick of. And I think Mahmood recognises that, but at the same time, she recognises the way parliamentary arithmetic works. And you can well imagine that actually a lot of this has already been very stage managed, and the bulk of the Labour Party have probably been given some trinkets and probably given some efforts to conciliate their concerns to make sure that they come along with them. But at the same time, actually, I'm very surprised by the sheer amount of outspokenness that we have seen from Labour MPs. As you said, some of those.
Why are you surprised?
I just thought that there would be a recognition that this was an issue that they needed to grip, and I didn't think they would lose control quite as much as they have when you've got sort of Kent MPs, at the real coalface of this crisis. Maybe I was a bit naive in sort of assuming that actually Labour MPs had the interest of the country at heart, but I really thought that party management would have managed to make sure that these instances were avoided. I mean, I don't know whether this is going to be just a few ripples or whether this could actually result in a tsunami, but I would still nonetheless have a few concerns if I was a minister trying to put this through the House of Commons.
Wait, so you mentioned the ECHR. This is something there's much talk about and debate. Reform have said for a while we need to pull out of the ECHR, and the Conservatives have gone back and forth. Initially, when Kemi Badenoch became leader, she said, no, it's too complicated to leave, but we need to kind of work around it. Mahmood has taken a position where she doesn't want to leave it, but she has articulated correctly, I think, that Article 8, which is the rights to a family life clause of the ECHR, has been gamed against our country. And so she is putting ahead of that the UK's priorities. Now, it's worth just going, and maybe you have examples of how Article 8 has been gamed. Of if there's...
Well, it's the chicken nugget example, I think, is the go-to one, isn't it? It was the individual that couldn't be returned to, I think, Albania because his nephew was only really a fan of British chicken nuggets, and he wouldn't be too keen to dine out at sort of the McDonald's in Albania or something like that. I mean,
wait, that is a real
example. The Telegraph have done an absolute a barrage of these individuals. A favourite of mine was an alcoholic. I think he was a foreign national offender, not an illegal migrant. An alcoholic that committed a really violent assault but couldn't be returned to his country of origin which I think was Pakistan, because there was concerns there wouldn't be enough alcohol to meet his needs, or there would be sort of a stigma around his alcoholism that was much greater than he would receive in Britain. So these are the kind of things that have been appealed to under the ECHR more generally. I think Article 8 is something where there's a bit more scope to tighten it because it's a sort of a fluffier right under the ECHR, and in that it can be weighed up against other considerations. So what Mahmood is saying is that the right to family life of an individual will be stacked against the public interest of removing them, and that is something you can do or maybe move towards doing with Article 8. But when it comes to Article 3, which is the right to not be tortured and to avoid degrading treatment, that is an absolute right, and that actually is a right that can't really be stacked up against public interest tests. And that is where you see those instances such as that alcoholic that couldn't be returned to his country of origin. And I think it's important to recognise that a lot of there's been a lot of talk about sort of reviewing the climate in certain countries that refugees have come from, and if situations have changed, then these individuals will be returned. I think we need to recognise that a large part of the asylum system and a large number of applications are actually done by individuals with incredibly personalised circumstances that aren't based on the sort of top-line geopolitical picture of their country of origin. It's done on, they might have fallen foul of a sort of a drug gang in their country of origin, or they might have sort of been chastised because of their sexuality or religion or something like that in the local community, and therefore they've made appeals on really, really precise basis. And this is why I think the argument that or the suggestion from the Labour government that they're going to be able to sort of review everyone's refugee status after 30 months and if circumstances have changed, falls apart, because it just simply will not be feasible with a Home Office that is already sort of creaking at the seams with of thousands and thousands of individualized cases that aren't just simply based on the regime in charge of a country or the conflict that a country might or might not be in.
The immediate problem to me that comes up with the idea of a review every 30 months of the asylum is, firstly, Mahmood acknowledges that there are 100,000 asylum seekers currently staying in asylum hotels at considerable cost, the famous number being £8 to £9 million a day. She argues that the number of asylum hotels has come down a lot over the last year or so, but there's still 100,000. And then I just had Alison Pearson, the Telegraph journalist, on explain with her expose from someone speaking anonymously from within the asylum system, saying that there are about 100,000 asylum applicants who slipped through the gaps and just kind of went and moved into Britain working in the black market. So we're talking about a hell of a lot of people here. But this was the idea of a renewal every 30 months is, if you look at this expose Alison Pearson did, there's such a backlog of work. They're giving themselves more work here. They haven't got a system that can go through already the current quantity. And this is what Rishi Sunak was trying to do, was that he was trying to speed up and clear the backlog. And that he ran on the campaign he ran on was to clear the backlog of asylum. So now we're kind of creating a whole new backlog of the kind of reappraisals.
Well, quite. And, there was a really good revelation from Alison Pearson. These sort of implicit withdrawals have been something that have really ballooned in recent years. And actually, I think it really just is indicative of not just the inability of the Home Office and its contractors, it's sort of the charities that it pays hundreds of millions of pounds to operate contracts to keep tabs on these individuals, but it also puts paid the idea that sort of housing them in hotels or in communities really away from the eye of the authorities is in any way a legitimate idea, because as we've seen and as Alison spoke about, this is just an easy way for individuals to disappear into the black economy. And especially when you consider that BBC did an expose recently, actually in my hometown of Crewe, about a sort of a channel migrant who had his asylum application rejected, but because he'd sort of been brought over under the protection and the auspices of a Kurdish drug gang, had been able to just disappear following them and be housed by them, working in a kind of I guess you would call it a kind of very, very constrained and very, very restricted working relationship with those individuals that have brought him over. But nonetheless, he has completely evaded the authorities and has ended up actually being able to make somewhat of a life for himself in Britain. And we don't recognise that enough when we have these conversations. We don't recognise enough that many of these individuals are actually already coming knowing that they have something lined up for them. There's modelling which shows that actually the larger an illegal migrant diaspora from certain countries you have in Britain, the more likely you are to see those flows continue, because you've got those networks over your social medias and your telegrams and whatnot that says to them, oh, we can sort you out with X, we can sort you out with Y, there's a car wash down the road that's looking for someone to work for. So this is something that the Home Office has just allowed to proliferate through the decision taken by the last Conservative government to house these individuals in hotels rather than to actually invest that money, those billions of pounds. We've already spent about 16 billion in the asylum system since 2019, a lot of it on hotels.
16 billion
since 2019, and I think current forecasts suggest that by the end of the decade we'll be seeing 15 billion more. So this is clearly, and this is why the public are so fed up, because it's a situation that has just exploded beyond all recognition. We've gone from hundreds of millions to nearly 5 billion a year, but I think that money would have been much better invested in constructing detention facilities where those individuals that are come across on small boats could be housed. At the moment, we've only got about 2,000 beds, I think is the capacity of the immigration detention estate in this country. And if you think about actually, many of those individuals are in there for a long period of time and putting up appeals and stuff like that. Actually, we've got a real clogged up system there. And I think, the government are right to recognise that military bases are something that can be used, but use them properly, put sort of parameters around them, put guards on them, make sure that these are actually detention facilities for individuals to be housed in until they're removed. So we took a very bad decision in 2018, and actually things have cascaded from there as a result.
Okay, so hang on, slow down a second. What happened in 2018? What was the decision? So
that was when the decision to really explode the use of hotels first began, and then we saw a couple of years later large 10-year contracts being awarded.
Who made that decision in 2018? It would have been.
Would it have been
Theresa May?
I think it was either Amber. Yeah, it would have been under the prime ministership of Theresa May. It would have either been one of her many Home Secretaries. She got through quite a few. I think it might have been Sajid Javid took that decision in 2018.
And the decision specifically was to
rather than sort of look at the fact that you've got a few individuals you're housing in communities that have come here on small boats or in lorries, and to actually try and move away from that, to double down on the use of the embryonic use of hotels and to start awarding 10-year contracts worth hundreds of millions of pounds to private sector companies. And there was a fork in the road at that moment when these small boats first started. And I don't know if you remember, in 2018, actually, the first couple of small boats coming across was front page news. It was a big issue at the time. It was seen as a national security crisis. I think we're just so numb to seeing those images now that we've kind of lost sight of that fact. But they realised that there was a start of a problem emerging there, and that channel crossings were going to be a feature of the future. And rather than actually put in place new measures to house these individuals in new and improved and built up detention facilities, they decided to actually just look at what they already had, which was the use of a few private sector hotels and HMOs, and to just go down that route because it was easy, it was at hand, there was a precedent for it. And the result has been, obviously, as I said, billions of pounds wasted really for nothing actually in return for the British taxpayer.
And those billions, those figures, did you say 16 billion? Did you say since 2019?
Since 2019, it's been 16 billion. Yeah. So we've had sort of...
And that just breaks down just for accommodation? No.
So a large percentage of that is for the accommodation, but of course within that is, I think it's about 50-60% of that is on the accommodation element of it. But then there's also within that the welfare support that these individuals get, the 24/7 around the clock. You know, if you don't like the food you've got, you can call a helpline and tell them that it's not sort of meeting your satisfaction. If you've got a problem with your roommate, you can call up, things like that. So there's those elements, there's the legal support, and there's other sort of administrative processes to go through as well. So it's the all-encompassing welfare bill. It's not just the hotels, but the hotels undoubtedly are a huge part of that.
And so just to be absolutely clear then, that's just for illegally arrived asylum applicants?
No, that is for other individuals. So about 50% of asylum applicants are those that have come into the country illegally. Another 50% are those that have come in on student visas, work visas and so forth. And then a large number of those are very, very shaky as well. There was a reportage of an individual who'd sort of arrived on a student visa and his uncle had fallen out with him and just decided to stop sending him money to support his studies, and rather than just simply return to his country of origin, ended up putting in an asylum claim. I don't actually know where that ended up. I think probably, I would hope that was rejected, but we just don't know with the state of the Home Office.
We're going to circle back to talk about the economics of it all. But I just want to go back to this ECHR thing. So in your opinion, is it enough to work around as Mahmood is doing, or do you think we need to leave the ECHR?
I have no conviction at all that the Home Secretary will be able to in any way reform the ECHR in a meaningful sense. I think it's a bit like the European Union.
She's not claiming to reform it. What I think she's trying to do is work around it.
No, to the way that Article 8 is implemented, she's trying to say that we're going to sort of reform our approach to that. I'm not convinced that will in any way actually bear fruit, especially when you consider the individuals that will actually be able to make judgment on some of those Article 8 claims are, of course, an immigration tribunal system that is chocked to the rafters with individuals who have backgrounds in human rights law and left-wing campaign groups and so forth. So I just don't think that will ever actually materialise. We've seen now so many prime ministers say that they're going to really grip this issue, and Theresa May really made a big song and dance about reforming the implementation of the ECHR and the Human Rights Act, and it just amounted to absolutely nothing. I'm convinced now that the only way to solve this problem is to leave the ECHR and the Human Rights Act, but also other international treaties that we in Britain seem to have a real peculiar habit of gold plating. So the Refugee Convention being one of them. The Refugee Convention places an onus on host countries, Britain, to make sure that measures are in place to ensure that asylum seekers are integrated and refugees are integrated into the community. That doesn't necessarily mean actually that you have to give them sort of full access to the welfare state. You don't have to give them full access to effectively the settlement that many legal migrants aspire towards. Unfortunately, in Britain, we've interpreted it as meaning that refugees effectively, once they're in the country, won't be returning home, and that every step needs to be taken to sort of encourage them towards that settled status, and then actually from that naturalisation as well.
So the other part is the Human Rights Act, which was brought in 2005, and she is she. Have I understood this correctly, that she's trying to work around this act?
So the act is obviously implements the ECHR. So if she wants to sort of determine the way that the right to family life and the right to right to avoid degrading treatment and torture is implemented, you have to go with that primary legislation, and that is where that potential moment of jeopardy does occur with the Labour MPs and having to push through certain measures through Parliament, and that's where actually they'll need a pretty good whipping operation.
I see. And then another one she's trying to reform is the Modern Slavery Act, which was brought in when Theresa May was Home Secretary in 2014. And this also is being gamed, like all of these things are being gamed. And this is really upsetting a lot of the Labour left, I think. It's a classic thing. It's a kind of rhetorical wordplay, which you have a good name for something, if you're against it, it sounds like you're evil and sort of a new Hitler. But so to be against the Modern Slavery Act sort of implies that you are for slavery.
Well, and this is how it almost feels Orwellian. Sort of terms are applied to things, and probably a lot of them are drafted with the very best of intentions. I think Theresa May did spot that there was a certain problem with individuals ending up in really unsavoury and dangerous working relationships with their employers, having arrived illegally. But actually, what you've ended up giving them is just another route that, if you're canny enough, or if you have the right support network, or if you have the right access to lawyers, there will be workarounds. And, I think the Modern Slavery Act actually was a bit of a sort of hastily cobbled together piece of legislation, because Theresa May really wanted to sort of tackle this in 2014. And unfortunately, what we've seen really since 2014 is a huge number, an ever-increasing number of appeals made under its auspices. And it's a situation that, again, has just been allowed to fester. There's been no actual effort to tackle this head on. And the situation now is we've almost got this sort of internalised within the British body politic as something that just has to be allowed to continue as is.
But crucially, it's being appealed to by people who might not actually have been found to be slaves, but it's used because it helps them in their process to kick the ball down the road.
Along with every other thing that they sort of uncover, whether it's the sort of, the bathtub baptisms that the Church of England has been conducting, individuals becoming Christian and able to make a claim under the ECHR, or, the homosexuality appeal. If you can profess to be homosexual, you can't be returned to a country that's sort of very Islamist in its outlook. And unfortunately, actually, a lot of the stuff does seem well-intentioned, but in many cases, we're not dealing with individuals that are well-intentioned. Many individuals are looking to gain the system. And I include, in large part, a lot of immigration lawyers in that. I think a lot of immigration lawyers take perverse delight in helping circumnavigate the sentiment and the spirit in which a piece of legislation has been passed, and actually almost converted into a tool just to really keep our borders as open as they currently are. So a lot of this stuff, and at this point we now know where a lot of the problems lie. We know where a lot of the problems lie with the Human Rights Act and how ridiculous it is, or the ECHR. We know about these appeals under modern slavery laws as well. And I think actually now we've almost got a corpus of case studies that we can look at and recognise where those potential pitfalls are and start looking to tighten them up.
So I also noticed that I did a very interesting interview with investigative journalist called Zach Garner-Perkis about how many of the small boat crossings across the channel end up being indentured servants because they can't actually pay for the ticket to get on in the first place, so they sign up and end up in the black economy in Britain. A lot of them on the sort of food delivery apps where it's not their app, but the money goes straight to the person there. So it's not evident to me that this Modern Slavery Act actually did much change. Or
No. Well, I mean, you just have to walk down a sort of high street in London or a high street in small towns. You can see the sort of you can see the sex trafficking. You can see the modern slavery when it comes to car washes and nail bars and so forth as well. And you can almost sort of just palpably sense it on certain streets.
But I didn't know that. What do you mean car washes and nail bars?
Well, a large part of the problem is that many individuals sort of throw their lot in with these gangs, and if you're sort of paying a gang, or you're sort of putting your faith in a gang to take you to a country and they're promising you work opportunities, there's an element of threat that's used with individuals that know that they've sort of come into the country against the immigration rules of Britain, and they're therefore almost cowtailed into sort of continuing with that indentured form of employment because of that fear of sort of being deported and ending up sort of actually removed from the country.
And those types of employment include nail bars,
nail bars,
car washes,
barbers, vape shops. I mean, I think there is an element of the sort of proliferation of brothels that we see in places like London as well that's linked to this, but I think that probably slightly more tangentially. But, pretty much anything that is a cash-in-hand predominantly industry, you can imagine there's some element of it being used.
Do we have to imagine, or is there hard evidence for it?
So,
what is it? Like I said, Zach Garner-Perkins did the work and found evidence of it in the food app delivery stuff. But is there actually? We've got evidence in these other industries and other businesses, rather?
Not masses of it. Again,
so we're speculating.
But you can kind of see there's a correlation between it and where sort of immigration enforcement raids are more likely to find individuals working illegally. A sort of individual on a certificate of sponsorship that's arrived here legally is not going to be in perhaps the same damaging or dangerous relationship with their employer as an individual that's working off the books, unbeknown to the authorities in these individuals, in these businesses that are far more likely to actually see immigration raids. So I think, as far as I know, the best data we can actually do is to kind of assume a correlation between immigration raids and illegal working and modern slavery. But I don't think there is actually a authoritative literature that would show that certain industries just have, X percentage of the modern slavery claims or anything like that.
Well, whatever the case might be, Mahmood has a solution for this particular problem, which is digital ID, which we know all about, of course, and we've covered it on this show. And Prime Minister Starmer has talked about it and outlined his plans, but it is in the proposal by Mahmood for her reforms that digital ID is going to deal with this emerging black market. Do you think it can?
Well, I think any foreign national that's here under immigration controls has an e-visa, which they have to provide to potential employers to conduct right-to-work checks. So that's individuals that are actually here, study, work, or indefinitely to remain. They have to prove that they are eligible to work. That's a legal requirement placed on employers. And this is why the idea of extending the need for digital ID to the population writ large is so absurd, because those that are likely to be working illegally, or that portion of society, the foreign national portion of society where the illegal working does take place, is already required to produce those so-called digital IDs if they want to get a job. So this is a situation where actually unscrupulous employers are already going to be shirking right-to-work checks because they can. Just because digital IDs are introduced as a requirement to work doesn't mean that they're suddenly going to become steadfast upholders of the rule of law. So the whole idea that digital ID is required to tackle illegal working is ridiculous. I do think actually an encouraging component of the plan is the fact that e-visa checks will be extended to individuals that are the foreign nationals that are going to work for a company as a freelancer or as a contractor, because a large part of the illegal working problem does extend to those that have slightly looser working relationships and are sort of doing so as a sort of freelance temporary worker, or an individual that's just doing a bit of something here or a bit of something there for an employer. So I think extending it to contractors and freelancers is a welcome move, because I do actually think that will require at least these gangs obviously have those sort of off-the-grid businesses, the kind of cash-in-hand, unmonitored networks.
One of the deterrents that Mahmood has put in is for punishing countries that don't take back those who come here illegally. So there'll be a sliding scale of penalties, and there'll be visa bans. There's one thing that's been suggested. And oddly, they named 3 countries, Angola, Namibia, and the Congo, as countries where they've got some sort of deal. It seems odd to me, because I can't imagine we have many legal or illegal immigrants coming from those 3 countries.
No, well, those 3 countries, since the small boats crisis started, we've had 6 illegal migrants come across on small boats. Just 6. So it's not a huge problem. And when it comes to actually the clout that a visa ban would have, those individuals last year saw across all visa types, so including visitor and transit visa and temporary worker visa types, they saw just 6,100 visas actually awarded out of about 3.1 million. So that's less than 0.2% of all visas awarded. I do agree that visa bans are a very good idea, and the Tories were absolutely right to include it in their Nationality and Borders Act. And we have actually seen Trump have great success with countries in Western Africa who have been very reluctant to take back either foreign criminals or illegal migrants. And he's actually not just bounced certain countries into taking back their own foreign nationals, but to act as a third country in the way that we tried to achieve with Rwanda. So we need to recognise as Britain, we are a big, attractive destination. We have large economic clout on the world stage. We have large cultural clout. We are one of the biggest providers of overseas development aid in Europe. There are a whole range of levers at our disposal that we have been far too reluctant to ever even consider exercising. They're just sort of sat there covered in cobwebs. So I'm glad that we're recognising that these are potential options. I just wish that Mahmood had perhaps picked more relevant countries to actually use this scheme on. You know, you think of sort of, I think it's Pakistan had the highest number of asylum claims last year.
Really?
So yeah, so you think, you know, there are perhaps better outlets to try this measure on, and, you know, she could maybe be arguing that, oh, we're just going to give it a sort of a test run on these three countries. But, you know, as I said, 6 individuals have come across on small boats since 2018 from those 3 countries.
It's just
That's how small fry it is. I mean, maybe she's confident that we'll be able to get them sent back very quickly as a result of it, and she'll be able to herald it as a success. But I just wish she'd had a bit more confidence to actually put some of the big relevant nations in the frame from the get-go, rather than saying it's all sort of pending how this is assessed and how this goes on. Because again, we don't really have time for sort of things to just be assessed and roll through. This is a crisis that is getting a lot worse. I think if current trajectory continues, between 2018 and 2029, I think we'll have seen sort of 400,000 individuals come across on small boats. So this is a situation that really actually we can't afford to sit and fiddle our thumbs and allow action to be pending further revelations or further insight. We need action now.
So one way in which right-wing politicians have been triggered by the proposals is that she has talked about creating more, quote-unquote, new safe and legal routes. So it's been called, I think Zia Youssef called it a Trojan horse.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, sort of talk about bringing it all down, but this has been put in there. Now, she actually mentions in the 35-page reform proposal what they've already done to bring Gaza students over. What could possibly go wrong with that? And this is, I guess, an example of the kind of thing that she's proposing, although they don't give other examples of what those new safe and legal routes might be.
Which is the terrifying bit. It is the terrifying bit that it's all open to a consultation. You know, there's no cap. There's not actually determinate which countries would be eligible or where individuals in which part of the world would be falling into these routes. And I think any government consultation doesn't reflect sort of a broad spectrum of views on certain issues. It reflects those that are most mobilised and most eager to have their views heard. And when it comes to Home Office consultations, in particular on immigration, it is the left-wing charities that are, you know, in many instances very much taxpayer funded. It comes to the immigration lawyers. It comes to those that have a real vested interest in this. And actually they end up sort of being able to exert undue influence on the way the government views certain situations because they hijack effectively these consultations. So she's not put any cap on numbers. She's not given us any indication of what she sees this as being. Is it going to be tens of thousands? Is it going to be, you know, small numbers of 12,000 cap? Is it going to maybe be even 100,000? You know, she's said that a large part of these safe and legal routes will be contingent on the preparedness of local communities to sponsor these individuals, but she's also said it's contingent on the preparedness of voluntary organisations to sponsor these individuals. Well, I can think of dozens of organisations that would be chomping at the bit to start sponsoring individuals from every corner of the world. These individuals, these organisations that are very, very keen to just effectively bring the whole world to Britain. I think we also need to recognise she's really thrown her lot in on this safe and legal route element with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees as well. And that is a very worrying thing because the UNHCR has such a broad interpretation of what a refugee is. I think it recognises tens of millions of individuals as potentially being eligible to fall into such safe and legal routes. So almost the ambiguity on that safe and legal route section of the plan is one of the most ominous parts of it, because it really could either be a very small fry thing, or it could be an absolutely devastating thing for this country.
Yes, I'm going to push back on that, because although I think that at the moment we need zero illegal immigration, if you've come here illegally, whatever the conditions, you don't get to apply for asylum. Maybe there's a conversation to be had about creating. I think the Tories came up with this idea, is that you commit to taking X amount, but you go out and find the people around the world who need that refugee, rather than expecting them to come here. But that's a kind of a problem from the time, because we've got to take care of Britain's issues first and foremost. This is clearly out of control. But just when you say you can think of lots of small organisations chomping at the bit to welcome refugees, I remember, I think this was David Cameron's plan to have for Syrians to come, and it would be small church communities would have, and I know of some of these church communities would welcome a Syrian family, and compared, and it's relative to other types of mass illegal immigration and mass migration, that worked better, only because they were actually in a community. And so I wouldn't necessarily be against that, except that right now we just need no illegal immigration.
I'm of the view that in the last 10 years, the British public have been expected to stomach a lot more than they should have been expected to stomach. They've paid far more than they should have been expected to an asylum system. They've tolerated changes to the community far beyond what they should have been expected. I think we need to just have an effective moratorium on the asylum system for a period of time. And when it comes to longer term, how we approach sort of unstable parts of the world, I think we need to try and reorient the way that global asylum system works. So, UN schemes at the moment very much place the onus on individuals being able to come to Western countries to be resettled. I think there's a very strong argument to be made that actually those countries that are culturally and geographically more proximate to areas that are unstable are a far more suitable place for individuals to...
Totally agree. And I'm sure people listening to me will no doubt be smarting by the idea, and they hear of Syrians come just because, of course, it was only 2 months ago that a Syrian-born British national killed Jews at a synagogue in Manchester. It was Jihad al-Shami was his name. And so I'm well aware of the downsides, and that's putting it lightly. Although I'd also note that Cameron at that time took a similar view to you and wanted to invest not just into. I think Syria's neighbours, so mainly Jordan, and he put some foreign aid instead of wanting to take refugees here, invested in the camps surrounding the Syrian border to help them there, which was a better idea, let's say.
Well, I think it is. I think it's something that is probably a lot more palatable for the British public, because it's not just about this remote, abstract idea of control, which seems to be where this policy document sets out. They work on the presupposition that the British public just hates seeing the chaos in the Channel, boats coming across with no real organisation to it, and therefore the creation of safe and legal routes in an orderly, proper manner is going to somehow fly. Now, I think that misreads the numer of where the British public are. So we're far more concerned actually about just the sheer numbers now at this point. I think, having seen 190,000 come across in a small boat, I think we need to recognise that actually we need to start having that preposition that individuals looking for asylum or fleeing persecution are able to do so far closer to home. And I think working with sort of, a Trump administration in the US and other sort of like-minded Western countries would be a far more beneficial proposition long term as well. And it would ensure that actually these areas don't see a brain drain that they're not able to recuperate. Because of course, losing large portions of your young male population really does have an impact on a society. I mean, look at us after the First World War. It took us a very long time to actually recover as a society, if we ever actually did. I think actually having sort of young male deserts across large swathes of the world isn't something that's going to breed stability in the long run.
Yeah, quite. And when it's males that come over without families, that's when you get into a lot of the criminal, particularly sexual offences.
Endless procession that we have seen in recent weeks. Yeah, absolutely.
So look, before we there's many details to the whole proposals Mahmood's making. Before we move on from them, because I wanted to ask you about the economic impacts of immigration, but is there anything else important that worth addressing here?
I think the only other one is they're shifting towards an asylum seeker gets one appeal against a rejection from the Home Office. I think that, again, is something that's designed for the British public to think is tough action. But again, when you consider the way immigration tribunals work, I think if an immigration judge is sat there and is kind of on the fence about whether an Afghan chap sat in front of him, whether his claim for asylum is legitimate or not, but he knows that individual, this is his one shot to get his rejection overturned, I think we're likely to actually see an uptick in the number of appeals that are upheld in immigration tribunals as a result of this, and therefore the Home Office's word will be even less final than it currently is, and actually we'll have a sort of another layer of this processing taking place in which many individuals are already sort of ushered through.
I hope you don't mind me being referencing Fraser Nelson, because he was a little disparaging about you and your organisation, but he did write a very good Substack comparing Mahmood's proposals to what's going on in Denmark. And although we've covered a lot of it, there's a couple of details that's worth pointing out to show where Mahmood didn't go as far as the Danes, and that she was inspired by. First, one is on language, and the Danes have strict rules about language testing for newcomers to come, and there's a little bit of that for work and study route, for the 10-year work and study route, but nothing mandatory on the level the Danes are doing. The Danes also have ghetto laws, which is there's quite literally a different criminal justice system, I would say. It seems like that way, where there's different rules and punishments for crime committed in certain ghettoed regions, and that, of course, is highly illiberal. I mean, it would be quite a step to do that. I also think of Singapore. Singapore it's not liberal at all, but they have designations about how many people of a certain demographic can live in each area to make sure that you don't get ghettoization. It is the case in Britain. We have got enclaves and ghettos, which is
but I also think that the idea of sort of splitting up those ghettos and sort of requiring individuals to relocate into other parts of the country that perhaps don't have quite an acute problem really actually, to me, feels unjust on those areas to which individuals are going to be moved. If you're moving an individual from an area where they've really not actually had to integrate or assimilate into the British way of life at all because they've had sort of effectively a culture that they're used to on their doorstep, I don't think actually expecting a sort of peaceful, tranquil Surrey village to suddenly deal with a large number of individuals moved out of, say, Tower Hamlets is in any way actually a just thing to move towards. So I'm glad that wasn't actually part of it. I know a lot of people very rightly point out that we do have large areas of the UK that are frankly very befitting that definition, but I don't think actually the solution to that is to sort of dissipate those unassimilated individuals into parts of the UK that perhaps have a slightly more harmonious relation with one another at this point.
What is the solution?
Well, look, I think there are certain criteria where it comes to encouraging individuals who perhaps have not really fallen into the British way of life to recognise that there are it depends as well on, of course, what route they're here. If you've got individuals that are sort of here on a work visa, I think it's a lot easier to say, actually, you are living in one of these areas where assimilation is very high, but because it's a very sort of non-British, quote unquote, area, we are going to sort of not renew your visa, and you're not going to have the eligibility to claim indefinitely to remain. I also think that there's a sort of a recognition that some areas in Tower Hamlets in particular have transformed in such a way in recent years that there is still a fluidity to that community that perhaps isn't as wedded, and therefore actually a lot of these individuals, especially second generation, do still have a sense of pull towards country of origin. I think actually when you look at sort of emigration statistics for second generation Moroccans, for instance, there's a large proclivity of those individuals actually to want to move back to where they feel their ancestral homeland is, or because they have such a cultural sense of pride in that area. And there's a large component of that we see in studies from other European countries, actually. So
I'm not quite sure how that's an answer to my question. Are you suggesting that they should go home to those countries?
I think individuals that are here on a non-citizenship route, and I think actually are here without citizenship, probably if they are still subject to immigration
But if they've been
controls.
Born here.
Well,
and you're saying the second generation.
Well, I think
the Moroccan, the second generation's got a pull for home, and you're
suggesting
that the best way to deal with enclaves is to send those people to those countries of.
Well, no, I'm saying
heritage.
that. I'm saying actually, it becomes self-fulfilling in the individuals that have sort of become socialized in areas that are predominantly, say, Moroccan or predominantly Bangladeshi, and they can sort of have that strong sense. They will emigrate themselves naturally anyway. This is what I'm saying. A study on Moroccan immigrants, I think in Denmark, suggests that a large number of individuals in that community are emigrating anyway, naturally second generation, and therefore there's an element of it sort of being such a cultural enclave of that culture that individuals actually think, well, no, you know what, I actually quite like the concept of returning actually to, or where my parents are.
That was in Denmark, was it?
I believe it was.
Is there anything equivalent in Britain? Do we have, because there's much has being said about the not only elder wealth creators and millionaires who are leaving Britain and emigrating, but there's also a lot has been said about, I don't know the numbers, and maybe you do, young people, aspirational young, who are leaving, and we're not talking about Moroccan heritage, we're talking about English heritage, British heritage, who are going to Australia, who are going to New Zealand, who are going to the Emirates, who are going to the States, who are going to Israel, and they're leaving. Not because of cultural reasons, but for aspirational reasons.
We just don't have the data in this country. We just simply, when it comes to emigration, we don't have a clue who is leaving. We have sort of forecasts produced by the ONS that suggest that 470,000 foreign nationals left and 80,000 Brits left, but we don't know the nature of those Brits that are leaving. And my working hypothesis is that a large number of those individuals that are leaving, that are Brits, are individuals of a ethnic minority background who have sort of become enamoured with sort of getting the authentic sense of what they believe their culture to be.
That's so interesting. And just on the comparisons with Danes, is worth pointing out that they actually have their own Rwanda plan, although Mahmood is not going to try that little experiment, a rather expensive experiment. The Conservatives got 700 million quid, I think it cost us, reporting all of 4 or 5 total. And they also have their jewellery law, which is...
their Rwanda plan, I don't think ever seen anyone delivered yet.
Oh, the Danes
taken
has
off.
it not? Okay.
And there is a component in the plan that's just sort of vaguely says, oh, we'll look at sort of third country processing, but no bigger commitment than that. I think they are still pretty keen on the existing plan that they've got with France as a one in, one out, but I don't think they've actually looked in any great detail at doing anything akin to Rwanda. And I think it would be political suicide for them to do it, given how much they kicked up a fuss about it. I think it should be done. I think definitely we need a third country deportation deal, but I just don't think the Labour Party will go near them. And I think that's why we've got that sort of fluff in this plan, which basically says, oh, we're looking at a few deals.
So look, having a whole conversation about the impact of immigration on crime, I think would be a podcast in itself. And you have you've done sort of criminological reports, and there's been debate, which we sort of touched on a little bit earlier with the Afghanis. But there was something more specific I wanted to ask of you to sort of end this conversation. And I also note that the cultural impact of immigration is kind of obvious.
Yeah.
And although that's somewhat still debated, and a sort of classic thing I see on social media is when someone of immigrant heritage does something great, everyone goes, or the sort of left or progressives or globalists go like, look how great immigration is. But then when it's the Pakistani rape gangs, it's just silence or denial. But that's a whole argument in itself. But I'm quite interested in the economic case against immigration. You've done considerable work on this at your think tank. What is the economic case against immigration?
So I think if we just took last year, for example, basically you can see immigration system isn't really orientated towards one that boosts productivity or economic boon, or to actually even, in large part, meeting certain labour shortages. Of the hundreds of thousands of visas that were awarded last year, just 20% went to individuals on an actual work visa, where it was in some way sort of recognise that maybe there's a shortage here and an individual should be brought in. Of that, 1% of visas were awarded to doctors. And what really has happened in recent years is we've had a long tail of individuals on dependent visas who, on the health and social care visa, which was brought in 2022 under the Johnson government, has basically saw two dependents for one worker, and that is a situation that simply isn't tenable, because those two dependents, yes, do have the right to work, but actually, are they going to be going into roles that are essential, or are they going to be going into roles that really kind of aren't really sort of adding much value to the country? And I'm thinking of delivery roles and so forth. So there's components to this. When it comes to the work visas themselves, that very, very small slither, sort of 2021 to 2023, about 70% of visas were awarded to an individual who would be earning a salary of less than £38,000 a year. Those individuals would...
That figure is key because...
Yes, I should have... That figure is key because that is at what point Oxford Economics determined a non-EU migrant would begin to break even. They'd be paying as much tax into the Treasury as they are taking out in terms of education, healthcare, and so forth. And that's accounting for the fact that they sort of are more likely to come with dependents. And, the figures do bear that out, especially on a health and social care visa, where the number of dependents have outnumbered workers astronomically. So that's the work visas. We then need to look at what's really happened when it comes to the student visas, which make up a large bulk of those visas awarded every year. Now, we're always told, that they're effectively keeping universities afloat. Without them, sort of, to be, they paint pictures of Cambridge and Oxford falling by the wayside and just becoming fiscally ruined. But really, actually, when you look at the data, a lot of these students are coming into very low tariff universities. They're coming into places such as, Good Education Limited, to study courses such as Marxism or wardrobe design or leatherwork. And these are the kind of things that really I don't see how they benefit either the body politic or those students alongside whom they're studying. So I think that's another conversation that needs to be had, because again, these students, yes, they are paying a lot in tuition fees, but are the universities really actually the best custodians of financial rectitude? Are they actually spending money well when they're wasting it on, hundreds of thousands on research products into the sort of the smell of homosexuality in Victorian Britain, all that kind of stuff? So I think there's a big problem there. But at the same time, they're placing huge pressure on housing stock. They're placing huge pressure on health services in those local areas as well. So there's a real fact that the Tories introduced a plan in, I think it was in 2019, saying they want 700,000 international students in UK universities at any one time. They didn't account for how that would impact local areas. They didn't account for actually whether these individuals, who they've now...
Their argument would have been that those students will be paying more because they have to pay there's a different fee for international students, and they have to pay the cost of living, although they would also have to work here. So their argument is that would be that would add to the economy, and they would come out.
Well, they can only work 20 hours a week, international students can, and in many parts it is, again, the Deliveroo economy is what they fall into. But again, I go back to the point of, do we really care if sort of Good Education Limited isn't able to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds every single year on really ridiculous woke research projects? Do we really care if sort of...
What's Good Education Limited?
It's just an example I use of the kind of the quality of the institutions that do exist. That long tail of really low tariff universities that are sort of, no one would even understand exist as a university. No one would even comprehend as something that's being allowed to provide degrees to individuals. But there is a long tail of them that sort of have almost sprung up in recent years as a result of this huge surge in international students coming into the country. So when it comes to actually just reducing raw numbers, I think the key way to go about it is to say we're going to put a very, very hard cap on the number of foreign students that can come into the country. And you know what? Some universities, some very, very poor universities, might actually just have to go under. And so be it. And we've had this ridiculous target in Britain for far too long that 50% of students of kids need to be going to university. I think that was a ridiculous state of affairs, and I think what that's really done is perverted the whole system away from actually just making sure that the best and brightest can go and study Keats or the classics or something like that, and has just created effectively a kind of 3-year stopgap for individuals to go and have a bit of a party and then really fall into a trap of long-term economic inactivity. And that's what we're seeing when it comes to the British in this country. We've got about 6 million economically inactive. Why do we have that scale? Because businesses have been able to pull a lever, bring in cheap overseas labour that fills those sort of entry-level jobs, and therefore there's been no incentive to invest in the British workforce. And this is something that is almost self-perpetuating. It's almost something that once you've started doing it and you realise you can get away with paying individuals a lot less if they're coming from, say, Zimbabwe than you would have to an individual that's been brought up in Surrey, then you kind of get hooked on it, and it becomes something that once you've done it once, you have to keep doing it and keep doing it again. So I think one of the biggest economic arguments against the mass migration we've seen has been the fact that it has allowed so many businesses to just simply shirk their obligation towards the British workforce. And this is why we have so many young people just languishing on benefits, not really doing anything with themselves.
Back to your point about 1% of immigrants being doctors. Is that an official figure? You've got
that is. So if you go on immigration system statistics, and I'll send it to you afterwards, you can see that of the 800 or so thousand visas that were awarded in 2024, it was about I think it was about 10%, so it's slightly more, 10,000, so it's about slightly more than 1% of individuals came as doctors. Medical professionals more generally, I think it was about 8 to 9%, but that of course includes a long tail of nurses and stuff like that, so not just sort of specialised doctors.
Now, what would, in a population of 800,000, what percent do we need doctors and NHS? So if you've got 800,000 people, what percent of any population, what percentage of them should be doctors or nurses or working?
I couldn't tell you, but it's definitely higher than that. I think it is definitely you definitely need a greater ratio.
So we're bringing in more than the amount of doctors could even cope with themselves, let alone contribute to the NHS, which
and not necessarily doctors
not doing great,
coming with the best standards. If you look at sort of doctors that were disciplined in the last 12 months, struck off or given a warning or sort of put on a conditional working environment, 56% were trained overseas as well. So there's a huge problem here when it comes to actually, if we're bringing in individuals who've got medical qualifications from overseas, are they perhaps trained at the same standard as a British trained individual would be? And this is why the fact that we have a cap on the number of medical school places every year at about 11,000 is so absolutely absurd, because it has made us completely reliant on medical professionals from, in many cases, third world countries who are on the World Health Organization's red list as being countries that are effectively already suffering health service shortages in employment and labour. Whereas rather than training our own individuals, we're bringing in individuals from these places, depriving them of those services and actually reducing the quality of care in our NHS as well.
So do we have a sense with regards to the economy, what the total figures are in terms of drain migration is? How much is it costing Britain?
Well, we know from the OBR that a low-wage migrant, and I would argue that they're very ambiguous with how they define a low-wage migrant. They keep trying to reinvent actually how they interpret what a salary a low-wage migrant is. We know that a low-wage migrant, of course, costs us £500,000 by the time they reach retirement age, and up to £800,000 by the time they reach their mid-80s. And this is why the conversation that we're having at the moment is so important about indefinite leave to remain, because, of course, the sheer number of individuals who came in over those 3 or 4 years who were doing roles that do pay less than the British average, do pay and do require skills that are less than actually what we need to boost productivity in this country. If they get that status starting from the 1st of January next year, they are here to stay, and we are therefore on a sort of...
But they can't claim benefits.
if they get indefinite leave to remain, they have the ability to claim benefits.
Right,
So
okay.
it's 5 years. You then get the ability to claim benefits after you get indefinite leave to remain. And there's figures that have come out that have sort of suggested that actually 30% of individuals that have indefinite leave to remain are in receipt of universal credit. That compares to about 18% of the British population. So that just gives you a sense of actually the low wage, low skilled nature of certain individuals already. And this was before we've even got to the historically unprecedented period of low wage, low skilled migration that we saw under Boris Johnson, where, as I said, 70% of individuals that came on a work visa were earning less than was needed for them to be paying more into the treasury than they are taking out. We also need to consider the fact that, we're in the 21st century now, and automation is just around the corner. And what we're actually doing by stuffing sectors such as the health and social care visa with low wage, low skilled migration is removing the incentive for those businesses to invest in some of the technology that could help them going forward. I've recently spent a bit of a time visiting a care home, and you kind of see some of the functions that are ripe for that kind of investment, kind of the paperwork or the cleaning and stuff like that. There was an ONS report in 2019, so a while ago now, but it was forecasting to 2030, and it suggested that Britain could have a health and social care sector where 50% of the sort of roles, the functions, could be automated. They wouldn't require human labour, but we have sort of eschewed that future for ourselves, and instead relied on bringing in hundreds of thousands of individuals to work in the health and social care sector for a period of time. And then, as I said, once they get that indefinite leave to remain status, they become they become eligible to claim benefits, and could very well cost us hundreds of thousands of pounds over their lifetime. So, and same with agriculture, there's some of the innovations going on there, the ability to determine the difference between a stone and a potato. That's something I probably couldn't even do on a bad day, but this is something that actually now exists. And yet again, we're still reliant on bringing in low-wage individuals to do that job, rather than sort of pulling the rug out from these businesses and saying, no, it's sink or swim now, put your money where your mouth is, and actually make sure that you're making yourself ready for the future.
Very interesting. I've got some questions to ask you over on our Substack for our Substack readers and viewers, including questions from Substackers themselves. But before we go over there, is there firstly anything important that you think we might have missed that you want to bring attention to? And secondly, is there anything of your work you'd like to bring attention to, your website, social media, anything like that?
Yes, so you can find some of the reports that we've discussed today on migrationcentral.com, which is our Substack. We also have our website, which is centreformigrationcontrol.com. That's really where we put our research pieces out. We're aiming for about one a fortnight at the moment, just because we've been on a bit of a blitz with FOIs and so forth. So hoping to bring some more headlines to a newspaper stand near you soon. But yeah, other than that, I think we've covered a lot. Would just also say indefinite leave to remain, the Boris wave, it is a sleeping time bomb, and we need to start putting a lot more pressure on the government to make sure they actually deliver on what they promised earlier in the year, because in 6 weeks' time we have potentially 800,000 people beginning to get this settled status, and then once they get that, they're going to be very difficult to remove.
Oh, because that started... Because of when it started,
it started in 2021,
of course it did.
So,
and it's
6
only
weeks
5 years
time,
on.
So the clock is ticking. The Labour government have sat on their hands for a very long period of time. Some think tanks think this is going to cost us hundreds of billions of pounds over their lifetime. And the government doesn't seem to care. So I would urge people to start looking into actually...
So Mahmood didn't even mention it?
No, there's just constantly the dangling of, a big speech is coming out on indefinite leave to remain.
I thought she changed the indefinite leave to remain.
She said she's going to... but we are not clear whether actually she's going to extend the time period that it takes for an individual to get it from 5 years to 10 years. She said that, but we're not sure whether that's going to apply to individuals who are already here on work, study, or other temporary visas, or whether it's actually going to be only for individuals that are coming after that rule change takes place. So if it doesn't apply to those that arrive between 2021 and 2024, we have a real problem on our hands, because, as I said, this is a situation where we have brought in hundreds of thousands of individuals who are of little economic merit and could potentially set us up for a lot of fiscal problems in the future.
Robert Bates, a great pleasure speaking
Thank
to you.
Thank you, Winston.
Thank you so much.
When it comes to illegal working, I almost think we've sort of fallen into a trap, actually.
I've got to ask you about the French. Famously, Sunak did his £500 million deal. What did we get for £500 million?
We need to start taking measures ourselves, put in place a strong deterrent to make sure that anyone across the channel is deported, rather than simply hoping, crossing our fingers, that the French will sort it for us. My view when it comes to France, when it comes to cooperating with Europe, is...
What do you make of Starmer's one in, one out scheme?
The fact that we've already seen 2 individuals that have been deported sneaking back in suggests it's not being a deterrent. If it's not even deterring individuals who have been deported.
Thanks for watching the Winston Marshall Show with Rob Bates. Head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk now for an extended conversation with Rob, where we talk about the various deals with France and the situation with Ireland. That's all at winstonmarshall.co.uk. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and until next time, be well.